Welcome everyone to this final session in our series on 30 post-Soviet years. We're nearing the end of 2021, and the entire year of 2021 here at ZOiS has been dedicated to the events that happened exactly 30 years ago. 30 years ago, the Soviet Union was in its deepest and ultimately fatal crisis. And if we remember back in early December, Ukrainians had voted for their country's independence in a referendum. And on the 8th of December, the head of states of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine signed the Belavesia Accords, which established the Commonwealth of Independent States, which marked the demise of the Soviet Union. The Supreme Soviet of the Russian Republic then ratified these accords on the 12th of December, and symbolically quite important, on the 25th of December 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin and it was replaced with the Russian flag. But as we all know, a historical event of the magnitude of the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, doesn't simply come to an end. Instead, it lives on in the hearts and minds of citizens, but also in institutions of the countries that follow. And therefore, the decade that followed 1991 also continues to be imprinted by the collapse itself and has left its legacy 30 years on. And indeed, references to the so-called wild 90s have become a trope in Russian public and political discourse, and they are used as references also to discredit the democratic experience of the time. Narratives about the wild 90s furthermore intersect with narratives about economic chaos, political turmoil, and national disintegration. And they've become somewhat one-sided, with the aim also to stabilize the present political system. But as we all know, the 1990s are full of contradictions, and therefore there's also the potential for competing memories about that era to emerge. One can refer to cultural freedoms or artistic freedoms, among many other things, to bring these contradictions or the multifaceted nature of the 1990s to the fore. And therefore, it's not only the wild 1990s that we can encounter today in Russia, but also nostalgic references to a decade where maybe freedom was more visible. And I'm very pleased today to discuss this, among many other topics, with three wonderful guests. So first of all, I would like to welcome Olga Malinova, who is professor at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow and at the Institute of Scientific Information for Social Sciences of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Olga has published extensively on questions related to the memory of the 1990s and beyond, as well as political and public discourse in Russia. And I would like to mention that Olga is speaking in a personal capacity tonight. Second, I would like to welcome Oleg Lutohin, who is the Boris Yeltsin Museum Director at the Yeltsin Center in Yekaterinburg, a position that he took in January 2021, and previously he led the educational programs of the center for several years. Welcome, Oleg. And our third speaker is Mariya Mizernaya, who participated in the EUSTORY History Campus, which was a virtual summer school organized by the Körber Foundation, and in which several researchers from ZOiS were also involved. Mariya is a bachelor student in literature studies and philology at the Higher School of Economics. And my name is Félix Krawatzek. I'm head of the research cluster Youth in Eastern Europe, and I'll guide you through the discussion tonight. For all those in the audience who want to get involved and want to ask questions, you're welcome to do so via the chat, and I'll direct them to our panelists as we go by. And before we start, I also just wanted to quickly thank our partners with whom this 30 post-Soviet years event series has been organized, and that is in particular the Körber Foundation, the German Association for East European Studies, the German Historical Institute in Moscow, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Russia, and Memorial International. So Oleg, I wanted to begin with you. I remember the last time I was in Yekaterinburg, which is now 2 years ago, I also had the opportunity to visit the Boris Yeltsin Center and thought that this was a fascinating museum about Russian political history and, of course, Russia's first president. The center opened its doors in November 2015, importing to Russia kind of a very American tradition of presidential centers, and in the US as well, presidential libraries. And since for most of us here who are not in Russia, of course, traveling to Yekaterinburg has become a bit of a challenge that, well, we haven't really managed to overcome. I wanted to give you the word to tell us a little bit about what happened at the center over the last 12 months. What kind of activities have you been organizing to commemorate that very special year in Soviet and Russian history?
Well, thanks for having me. Can you hear me fine? Good. That's true. This year was special to us, not only because of the appointment of a new director of the Boris Yeltsin Museum. As the first presidential center, we had several anniversaries, all of which were keen to our mission, which is namely to study and publicly present the heritage of Boris Yeltsin and the very concept of presidency, which is in our country, and you're completely right, historically linked to the values of freedom, democracy, and human rights. All these values emerged in the 90s, along with the Institute of Presidency and Russian Constitution. Going back to this year anniversaries, I would mention the 90th Jubilee of Boris Yeltsin himself. On this special occasion, we set up several temporary exhibitions in the center and also at Yekaterinburg underground stations, because our city had the metro thanks to Boris Yeltsin himself. Also, 30 years ago, our country had its first presidential elections, and 25 years ago, the second one. And for sure, it is impossible to overestimate the significance of the coup attempt, which happened in August 30 years ago. In partnership with the Museum of Moscow, we opened up an exhibition called The Square of Free Russia, Площадь Свободной России. That's the name of the place in Moscow near the Russian White House, where during the days of the COP, over 70,000 of people gathered and defended Russian democracy. For this exhibition, we developed a series of public events, lectures, book presentations, and public talks, which witnesses and participants of those historical events. One of them is Evgeny Sevastyanov, the former head of Moscow KGB office, the man who closed the headquarters of the Central Committee of Communist Party right after the coup was suppressed. Well, you might know that the last day of that historical confrontation on August 22 started the tradition of celebrating the day of the Russian flag. On that special occasion, we hosted an open-air concert and the installation on our media facade as a part of the Square of Free Russia exhibition program.
Okay, thank you, Oleg. That sounds like a pretty busy first year. So I wanted to hear a little bit more. So now we have a feeling for what happened kind of this year dedicated to the events 30 years ago. But of course, the overall mission of the Yeltsin Center goes beyond just the anniversaries and has this task to preserve the history of 1991. And maybe you could speak to us a little bit about how the museum does pursue that mission of preserving 1991 and articulating it for Russians today. What does the general exhibition therefore look like?
Yes, thanks for the question. We preserve not only the history of the year 1991, but also the recent history of Russia, the history of the 20th century. But you're right, certainly right, because the 1991 is particularly important for our narrative. There are two parts of the museum exhibition. The first one, called The Labyrinth of Russian History, and it is dedicated to the 20th century. It unfolds the history from 1914 to 1987. And the second part of our museum, the second part of our exhibition, reflects on the time from 1987 to the end of 1999. this second part is called 7 Days That Changed Russia, and presented as an immersive series, I would say immersive TV show, if you would like to, if you can compare contemporary museums with Netflix or something. So we have our own TV show. 7 Days That Changed Russia, and it presented the history of 90s and the presidency of Boris Yeltsin. Of course, a day here is a metaphor for the whole set of events. And in that sense, day 2 is dedicated to the events of the second half of the 1991, when it all started on a gloomy morning in August. And I would like to show you a couple of pictures, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please do so. Let us immerse ourselves into the museum then.
Well, it is hard to... this is an exhibition I already mentioned, and this is the former KGB head, the head of Moscow KGB office, the witness and the participant of this event. This is an installation for our media facade I already mentioned. So we have a pretty huge building, as you might see, and this hall, this gallery, is the beginning of the day 2. You might see the TV, it is working all the time, and all the time you might see the Swan Lake on it, because that's exactly what the citizens of Soviet Union saw this gloomy morning on Monday. And here you might feel yourself as a Soviet citizenship who woke up and started to ready to start his working week. But what is interesting is what happens outside the door you might see there, because you might open it and find yourself right in the street of Moscow on the barricades. Well, pictures not completely. It is hard to show the emotion with these pictures. Of course, you should come and feel it by yourself with your body, if you let me say so. But the idea is clear, I believe. You are here. Well, nothing. Well, this is a famous book of Alexei Yurchak. Это было навсегда, пока не кончилось. It was forever. It seems that it lasts forever until it ends. And here in this apartment, you might see this feeling of wellness. That's everything will goes forever. But when you open the door, when you come to the streets, you see, well, it is almost a revolution. And some people here in Russia calls it first democratic revolution. Well, that's how it happens here in the museum. It is only one day. It's a kind of a teaser of our museum. Of course, I want everyone to come here and feel it by their own. Now I'm gonna finish the sharing.
Exactly. Now we are back.
Yeah. So that's how this event, particularly this event of 1991, presented here in the museum. Please come and see it.
So since we can't easily come at the moment, otherwise we would, of course, all come and be immersed. I mean, tell us a little bit about who is coming to the museum at the moment. I mean, what kind of people are making their way to the Yeltsin Center?
The average age of our audience is, well, it is fluent. It is 25, 31, and some year it is 31, 40s. So people in their 40s, they just want to go back to feel themselves back in the days and live it again, go through it again, through this experience. People in their 25s, they just want to maybe get know more about this event. And
okay, so we've got the
There are mostly people from Ural region, where we are located exactly, and of course from Moscow and St. Petersburg. And focusing on this audience, we create our programs. It is diverse. We have children activities for visitors from 4 years old. We also have a cinema club. We have a drama play, theater, inclusion programs, and programs for elderly people, of course, which are also our visitors, and we are also welcoming them all the time.
Okay, thank you very much, Oleg, for kind of providing this overview of what the center is doing, and also the post-Soviet and kind of the witnesses and the descendants who get involved and immerse these 7 days that changed Russia, and of course the general historical exhibition of Russian history as well. Olga, I wanted to turn over to you because I mean, the Yeltsin Center, of course, kind of takes a special place, I guess, in the kind of history or the way in which it preserves Russian history. And preparing for our discussion today, I also obviously realized once again how strongly critical some actors in Russia are about what the Yeltsin Center is doing, the kind of history that it tells. Among the critics, of course, are the Communist Party, but also nationalist movements. But one finds many approaches to kind of discussing what the position of the center is in Russian historical discourse. So I wanted to give you the word now to kind of provide us a little bit with some context about how you understand the role and the message that the Yeltsin Center transmits into the broader historical memory discourse in the Russian Federation. You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much for your questions. I should say that the memory about the 1990s in Russia is predominantly negative. However, I should say that Russia is not a kind of exclusion from the rule, because I participate, my experience of participating in a comparative book about memory, about post-communist transformation in Eastern Europe, demonstrated for me that the same is in the most post-communist countries. And it's clear why, because it was really a very hard time for many, many people. However, in Russia, I would say that there are some more reasons for having this negative predominant vision of the 1990s. One of the reasons is the fact that this period is actively politically used by politicians from different parts of political spectrum, and it's actively used by Vladimir Putin himself. My research based on transcripts of all Putin's speeches over 18 years has revealed that actually Putin, from his very coming to the president office, first as deputy president, because he substituted Yeltsin and had his own, ran his own electoral campaign. From the very first day, he actively used framing himself by contrast. There was the idea that the 1990s were a very hard time, but now, after the turn of the new millennium with the new young president, Russia starts another page, and the idea of contrast between turbulent 1990s and stabilization in the 2000s is a key idea of Putin's legitimation strategy. By the way, 2 days ago, there was released a new documentary about the recent Russian history. It was demonstrated on the central TV channel Russia. And the main idea of this documentary is pretty the same. The idea that it was very difficult time in the 1990s and everything has changed after Putin coming to office. However, this idea is shared not only by politicians, it's also shared by filmmakers. Now I'm talking not just about documentaries. We have some cinema production, fiction production, which also creates an image of time full of criminal, full of turbulence, etc. And of course, there are museums. Actually, Yeltsin Center is not the only and not the first museum that has exposition devoted to the 1990s. At the moment, I'm involved in research of expositions of different museums. And I should say that when we speak about museums, all museums try to do their best to have a more or less balanced picture of the 1990s. When we compare, you can easily see that Yeltsin Center and Yeltsin Museum in Yekaterinburg takes a very special position on the spectrum of museum exhibitions. Because it is the museum devoted to the memory of the first president of Russia. It's a very special type of museum. For this reason, it is the voice of Yeltsin and people who supported him that is dominant in this exposition. And for this reason, the voices of other people of Yeltsin's opponents are not that visible. They are there, but they are not that visible. So when you compare exhibitions, for example, with the Moscow Museum of Contemporary History, which former was Museum of Revolution, and it was very, hegemonic museum developing Soviet official narrative. However, it transformed, and now by the way, now it's again a very official narrative, as in 2016, it released the exhibition devoted to Putin time. And so, by the way, it's the only museum who has such exposition.
So, Olga, if Vladimir Putin contrasts himself to the 1990s as part of his legitimation strategy, of course, Yeltsin also needs to be discredited. I mean, how do we explain the political support that the Yeltsin Center then still has?
The thing is that for different people, the negative image of the 1990s is based on different things. And when we speak about Putin, he actively develops the image of the 1990s as a period of hard things, bad things that happened to many people. But he is not critical to Yeltsin himself.
Okay.
Quite the contrary, he is quite often very positive about Yeltsin. Oleg mentioned about celebrating a 90th anniversary from Yeltsin's birthday in February this year. By the way, on that day, Putin started his working day by visiting Yeltsin's tomb. There were cameras, of course, and he made a speech, a very positive speech about Yeltsin. This is one part of the story. And another part of the story is that Yeltsin Center settles the tradition that probably is important for Putin himself. It's the first center devoted to the memory of the president. And clearly someday there will be a memorial devoted to Putin. So it would not be wise to make any problems for institution like this for Putin.
Okay, thanks, Olga. That already brings some nice nuances to how complex the memories of the breakdown and the aftermath actually are. And we've already kind of touched a little bit on what has changed. I mean, with the young Putin in the early 2000s becoming president and contrasting his own rule to that chaos of the decade before. Could you sketch for us, Olga, the kind of with a broad brush, a little bit how the period that followed 1991, how that was remembered in Russia over the Putin presidency, basically? What has changed in the memory over the last 2 decades, the shifts that you would identify?
Well, if we try to describe it in a broad brush, I should say that memory about the 1990s is rather polarized. Of course, there is the majority who believes that it was a hard time. In March 2020, Yeltsin Center conducted a survey asking people how do they think about the 1990s, and 62% of people said that they believe that the 1990s has brought to the country more bad things than good things. 62%. But however, we should remember that also there were 19 persons who believed that the 1990s brought more good things than bad. These 90 persons are there, and I should say that in public discourse, they are quite active. So when you study, as I did, Russian public discourse about the 1990s, you can see that it's strictly polarized. And there are different opinions. There are people who believe that it was a time of freedom, it was democracy and other good things. And there are other people who believe that it was bad time because people suffered greatly and because Russia has lost its international positions. And it's bad. However, of course, there is some evolution in this picture. And also what is important is that when you look at surveys of public opinion, you will see that those opposite opinions that are very salient in public discourse do not have much support on the level of ordinary people. You can take like 10, 20 persons sharing these opposite positions. And as for majority, they prefer more, how to say, medium ground positions, or, and this is also typical, they say that they have no opinion. It's difficult for them to decide. This is very typical. And if we talk about public discourse, of course, we also have some shifts. And if to describe them shortly, is the main tendency is the rise of pessimism in the camp of the liberals, former Democrats, those who supported Yeltsin, who struggled for freedom and democracy and market reforms in the 1990s. And it's quite clear why it happens, because for sure the general tendency of Russia's development nowadays are very far from the ideals that were announced in the 1990s.
Thank you, Olga. And the polarization, you would say, just to return to that, that has increased over the last, or the positions have hardened over the last 20 years, or how would you place that over time?
No, I wouldn't say that polarization has increased. And I try to follow evolution of specific narratives. For example, narrative about August 1991, or narrative about political crisis of 1993. It looked like the position of Yeltsin's critics and their narratives remained practically the same. Of course, they are tuned according to changing context, but still it is the same. And my explanation of this is that for them, these events are a kind of myth of origin for these political groups. So it's a part of their identity. They stood very strongly for this. However, if you take their opponents, and if you take for example, people who doesn't have strong political position, they are just observers of political life. Their arguments became more and more diverse. I would put it this way. By diverse, I do not mean that they are positive or negative. I would say that their arguments become more complicated. They are more reflexive about what has happened. And I believe that this reflection is also a very important tendency of our time. And the interest to the 1990s, which we observe nowadays, greatly connected to this desire to understand what has happened. And it's natural. As we know from memory studies, 30 years is approximately this period when such traumatic events become reconsidered.
Okay, we'll stay with this dimension of time for one more moment. Oleg, I have a kind of question that links with what Olga said about the change of time. So the Yeltsin Center is fairly young, if one kind of thinks about how old one of these presidential centers are in the US. 6 years now, more or less. And obviously a lot has changed in Russia over these last 6 years. And I would be interested to hear you speak a bit about kind of that moment when the Yeltsin Center was set up. I mean, what were the driving factors? What was motivating it? Who were the actors that pushed that center to see live? Yeah, what was that symbolic moment? If you could capture that for us, please.
Yes, the first presidential center, which I am presented, the first presidential center in Russia was established according to the federal law number 68. And this federal law was adopted by Dmitry Medvedev when he was a president in 2008. So since the opening, in which, by the way, both Dmitry Medvedev and Vladimir Putin, it is hard to imagine now. I mean, two first faces of the country in one place outside the Moscow. So anyway, both Dmitry Medvedev and Vladimir Putin took part. Since our opening, nothing has really changed in our story about the events of the 90s. Except maybe that meeting with witnesses and participants of these events, they added new touches to the motley picture of that era. And I agree with Olga, when times come and we are celebrating 30 years, the picture of 90s became more complicated in the perception of the one who look at this time. So I've already told you about 7 days in the second part of the museum, but the number of the galleries at the second floor of our museum is not 7, but 8. The last room is called the Freedom Gallery. 5 columns presented 5 freedoms that Soviet citizens didn't have before the 90s, didn't have before the Yeltsin. Freedom of speech, freedom of traveling, freedom of meetings, freedom of trade, and freedom of religion, of beliefs. Please note that today these values are under threat all over the world. I mean, in 2015, no one could have imagined that we would ban from international flights. And I cannot participate at our discussion personally, offline. But this oppression of the freedom of traveling, this doesn't mean for us that we have to, for the sake of today's old time, we have to demolish one of the columns of our Freedom Gallery. On the contrary, we should be reminded of this more often for such an odd and, well, specific time. And we have to remind it of these freedoms as well as of Constitution, which in our museum, a whole gallery is devoted to. And going back to your question to Olga, addressing to Olga, why is today's administration support the first presidential center? I should mention that we are not governmental. We have public funding in our budget, but still we are this, well, something in between institution between civil society and business from the one hand, and from the other, we are separate ourselves from the government. So we are in that hybrid, I would say, position. And we usually describe ourselves as an interface for civil society in our country, which means that our participants of our program or our visitors could come and express their civil will in attempt to be heard in government, and maybe somehow and in some senses, in some cases, their voice became clearer and louder here in our venue, in our facility. But this federal law I mentioned, that's the key to the very tradition, because Olga was completely right that this is the first presidential center, and I hope it's not the only one. So someday there will be. I'm not sure if there will be Medvedev Center, but who knows? He had an ambition. I think we all know which center, we all guess which center will be the second one, and I'm very interested which will be the third one. That's the main intrigue, I believe, in our days.
You sound like a very patient person now. And thinking about patience, I mean, so 30 years ago, 30 years is also the time span more or less of a generation, depending on how many years you want to put around it. So Mariya, you've been waiting very patiently. And now I'd like to kind of change generational gear and give you the voice. So as it were, representative of the post-Soviet generation, you now have a lot of weight on your shoulder. But as I said at the beginning, you've been part in this virtual summer school that the Körber Foundation and Friedrich Ebert Russia organized. And kind of you and other students, you've been, I guess, doing an inventory of the 1990s and the time before and what is left of it and what that symbolizes for you. And you brought 2 sets of pictures with us. And I'd like you to share, the first set, the more personal stories, personal objects of the period of transition. And if you could explain to us a little bit why you've chosen these personal objects and what they actually signify.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. So the first personal object that I would like to share is a faceted glass. And the day I took this picture, I decided to start my day with some green tea. And when I looked into the cupboards, I realized that I, as well as pretty much every other Russian person, I suppose, have this piece of Soviet materiality standing right in my kitchen. And this is a faceted glass. And it's very, I think, prominent object in Soviet and Russian culture, and it's surrounded by many legends. One of them is that the 16 facets represent the 16 Soviet republics, and the ring above represents the unity of said republics, which is most likely a legend, but it's still there, and I think it's remarkable. And to me, this picture should have shown how the remnants of socialist past surround us so closely in our everyday lives. And the next picture I wanted to share was this one, and it's the district of North Chertanova in the part of the city where I grew up. And it was built back in the 70s as a very experimental neighborhood. So it was an architectural novelty even for Moscow. But then the initial excitement about this new shiny innovational district kind of wore off, and it was not entirely forgotten, but it was not as popular for a long period of time. But the surprising thing, I guess, is that it had a kind of revival in 2010s with content creators coming here to shoot, to make content such as music videos, photo shoots, and films that have this nostalgic feel to it and that capture this kind of odd, outdated space, but it brings that nostalgic feeling into every piece of photography or video that's made here. And when I was visiting the district to take pictures, I was happy to see that the neighborhood is alive and well, and people are ordering delivery and children are playing on those weird pieces of construction. So yeah, that was what I was trying to show, I guess.
Okay, so that's a very warm memory in the very physical sense of the term for the first one. Do you think, I mean, is that due to your own personal background, who you are, where you're from, that you've chosen these pictures? Or would you say this is kind of something that many other people of your generation might have selected? Or when you reflect a little bit upon your motivation for choosing them, do you think it's kind of rather unique or very typical for someone of your age?
I think that's not necessarily contradictory, those 2 points, because, well, I as a young person have encountered those objects and spaces in my everyday life, and I'm sure that many other young people have too, but to me it's still unique because it's a part of my background, my upbringing, and those objects and spaces bear a special meaning to me. So I would say both, if I'm answering your question shortly.
Yeah, okay. And Mariya, what about the the professional objects, as we call them? I mean, those that relate to your identity as a student, and that's obviously important for transitioning from young person then to the next stage. I mean, what are the professional objects that you brought?
So here, as you can see, is a studying area at my university, HSE, and here I tried to capture the small exposition of Soviet posters that we have hanging on the wall. And with this picture, I tried to convey how sometimes the present and the past make this really ironic conjunction, in a sense, with the COVID restriction tape and the political posters, kind of creating that weird mixture. And the other remarkable thing that I tried to show is how those posters are looking in a way sterile. So they are trapped in a glass and hung on the wall, and the table is distanced from them. So I think that's somehow telling a little bit about the way that we tend to deal with the remnants of the past. So sometimes we distance ourselves from it strongly. So yeah, that was the general idea of this photograph. And the next one, the last one, is from RSL, which is the Russian State Library in Moscow. It's also called Leninka, which, as you can see, it justifies the name fully. So it's the entrance area, and here we have a painting of Lenin hanging on the wall and a huge bust of Lenin standing right in front of the entrance. And when I first came in, I was a little bit overpowered by this mighty presence of Lenin, and I was really surprised how nonchalantly, I guess, people in contemporary clothing interact with this really ideologically charged space. So to me, it was a little weird and funny to see how people just mind their business and just take their coats and leave, where when there's such a powerful presence of something that's so politically colored in a way. And it's also important that it's maybe one of the most important libraries, if not the most important library in the country. So I think that's pretty telling.
Yeah, thank you, Mariya. Could you speak a little bit more about that? Have you said now the nonchalant way of engaging with that past? I mean, how that past is present in today's Russia, and the two examples that you gave, the student kind of working space and here the library. I mean, is that more like the background music we hear in a shopping mall where people are, okay, it's there, you don't really pay attention and nobody mind? Or take the example of the students. I mean, are there discussions taking place about, is it appropriate to still show these posters? I mean, are there debates among the student body, or as I said, or is it the shopping mall background music and it's kind of, yeah, you swallow it because, well, nothing you can do about it?
It's actually a really good question and a really good comparison, I would say, of the shopping mall music. I think it's there for those who want to engage with it. So the nonchalant interactions are the norm, but if someone wants to look behind it and focus a little bit more closely on the surroundings, that person is going to find that remnants are still there to engage with and to observe critically. So I think the posters should be kept at their place, and perhaps the Lenin bus as well, because I personally had that experience of this non-critical engagement with my surroundings, and then during the project I learned to look more closely at the objects that surround me, and I was gifted this beautiful and interesting world of busts, paintings, posters, bas-reliefs, and other things that just wait for me to look at them and to be reminded of the past.
Okay, but there's no, because I mean, there has been huge controversies about statues and monuments in many other countries. Roads Must Fall, one of the most very prominent movements in Britain, and you're nodding. Is there an equivalent debate happening among students at HSE if, you know, these Soviet posters must fall, or even if it's not as institutionalized as it happened in Britain, but are there these debates sometimes happen on the corridor, or is it more affirmative and it's part and should stay there?
Actually, I haven't heard of any debates, but I think the setting itself is such that no one would be opposed to it. So it's very clear that it's an exhibition. So the posters are paired with the programs for poetic evenings and stuff like that. So it's very obviously not something ideologically charged. It's just there to remind of the past in a very not propagandistic way. So I don't think any debates could arise around that. But concerning the statues, the monuments, the debates are very much there, and the topic is still alive. So we had a huge debate about the monument of Dzerzhinsky in one of the buildings of Wishka, HSE, and the debate was very heated. And actually, I don't remember what, I think they left the monument there, but it's still symptomatic that students just engage so actively in matters like that. So it's being discussed and criticized.
Okay, let's move over to you, Olga, because you've been looking or following the research that has been done on these intergenerational differences and the politicization or lack of it of different student generations and their engagement with history. And I would be interested to have your academic perspective on how the young generation born after the fall of the Soviet Union, how do they engage with the dissolution of the Soviet Union? What is their memory? How does it contrast or not contrast to that of the people who were still socialized in the Soviet Union? I mean, do they reflect the young people, the general population, or is there a sharp contrast that you would draw depending on when people such as Mariya were socialized or older generations? Yeah.
Well, you know, it's very complicated. On the one hand, we have representative surveys or research conducted with a representative survey method, and they demonstrate that actually the younger generation also feels negatively about the memory of 1990s. The survey of Levada Center, which I mentioned, let me remind you, there were 62% of respondents who believed that the 1990s brought more negative things than positive. Among those 62%, younger people demonstrate lesser figure. They are 53, which means they are slightly more positive in comparing with people of older generations. However, we also have another research with slightly different methods, asking people which time they consider better, Brezhnev's time, Putin's time, or Yeltsin's time. And in this research, it was conducted by the Institute of Sociology. They've got the result that younger people were approximately in the same position as elder generations. What is most interesting for me is a series of research that were conducted by qualitative methods, basing on interview. And by the way, quite a large number of such research was conducted by younger researchers. It means that a younger generation of researchers has an interest to studying these intergenerational changes. And if I can summarize their findings, the first thing will be that yes, younger generation is again not homogeneous in their attitude towards the 1990s, meaning that there is the minority that is interested. And for this minority who is interested and who wants to learn more, we can see that their major source of information are their families, and their families affect greatly how do they feel about the 1990s. And interestingly, that another source of information are films. I do not mean documentaries, I mean, you know, films with action. And of course, those films probably construct, again, negative images of criminal, etc. But what is again interesting is that younger generation differentiates between good political things, meaning that they appreciate freedom that was in the 1990s. They are positive about some political aspects of the 1990s. Of course, they do not remember about the crisis of 1993 and other things when they argue this way. Still, they are much more negative when they remember about economic aspects of the 1990s. And the last thing I'd like to draw to your attention is that surprisingly, but the positive or negative attitude towards the memory of the 1990s quite often do not correspond with attitude to Putin's rule. Younger people can be quite positive about Putin and at the same time quite positive about the 1990s, which somehow contradicts the Putin's way of legitimation. So it means that, again, this is not representative findings, they are qualitative. But if we can trust this tendency, then it looks like when people start learning more about the 1990s, and we have such, we observe such interest, it not necessarily means that they become less positive towards Putin. It's interesting. My explanation is that the younger generation is much more postmodernist in their attitudes, meaning that for them it's quite natural to not to notice, you know, things that contradict to each other in terms of ideology. They are not ideologically consistent quite often.
Yeah, that's really interesting, right? This division between the historical memory and the political assessment, even separating the institution that carries the view on history that one agrees with from that institution. So we see it also with the Great Patriotic War in the 1990s, as you illustrated. Yeah, that's really remarkable. Okay, Oleg, I also know I wanted to stick with this question of the generations a little bit, because I know that the Yeltsin Center also tries to obviously reach out to the kind of post-Soviet, non-Soviet generation. So there are two questions there for you. I mean, first of all, what is your assessment of what we've just discussed? I mean, how do young people in Russia relate to the Soviet past in the 1990s? Do you agree with what Olga and Mariya have been saying, or kind of what would be your addition to that from also your experience of probably seeing a lot of young people travel through the center, visiting it, and since you were leading the educational program, I guess you discussed a lot with that new generation. Could you share insights of that with us?
Yeah, I'll try. And I would agree with what Olga and Mariya mentioned already. And I also agree with this contradiction that Olga mentioned, this polarization of the perception of the 90s, of the epoch. But I would say the second point, the second extremum of this polarization is a nostalgia. And Olga, do you remember the survey, well, the inquiry which your colleague, the anthropologist Lutohin, presented at our conference dedicated to the 90s at the object of, as a subject of the politics of memory, the policy of memory. It is a very good anthropological survey on digital artifacts of memory, or digital methods of commemoration of 90s. It is very simple in its core, because what Ilya did, he go to the Instagram and Facebook and press the hashtag nostalgia, or variety of this term, and look nostalgia 90s, nostalgia 90, and look how this presented. There was lots of pictures, lots of images of this romantic feeling, of this blue jeans dyed up, of this sport clothes, you know, this and the core of this nostalgia, as I believe, is a core of the fashion of 90s, because that's what we are living through today. And of course, it's go apart from the political content of this time, or historical complications and difficulties of this perception. And what we are trying to do in our museum and in our program is to find the middle ground between this non-reflective nostalgia and this bad image of 90s. 90s as gloomy time, as wild 90s, what was gangs, crimes, and drug addicts, and nothing was good at all. That's what we are trying to do. But if we are speaking about non-Soviet generation, it is not only students who reflect as brilliant and speak English as brilliant as Mariya. It is also people who was born like really recently, and it is challenging to explain the Museum of Political History to people who were not even born in the 90s. And our educational department develops various programs for our youngest audience. In our schedule, you might find activities for kids at the age of 4. Well, in this age, it is not necessary to talk about history and human rights, of course. But in order to acquaint them with how the museum works, we develop the fairy tale tour on the museum named Who Lives in the Museum? For older kids, we have various museum quests, like how economy works. It's a thematic quest. Or museum quest, which helps you to prepare for the party in the style of the 90s. That's how we apply the principles of edutainment and gamification. And of course, the game is the key answer to this question, how to involve young people to the complicated topics and complicated narratives. And that's a thing I want to show you. This is a board game we developed, the deficit. It is, it puts the player into the context of late Soviet economy, when people had to be very skillful in order to get any goods in the shops with, you know, with empty shelves, which we already also have in our museum. Well, there are various characters like attentive grandson, or the lover of various kind of music, or good friend. She's a good friend. And you know, this kind of a monopoly upside down. That's how I tell. Monopoly without the capitalistic rules.
Yeah, that's what I just thought. I would like to have that game, Oleg. It looks like much more fun than Monopoly.
Yes, so I'll send you the box.
if I may just, I would like to bring in Mariya on that point, because you've been mentioning the nostalgia, the romantic feeling, kind of the blue jeans atmosphere, and organizing kind of a party in the 1990s style. I would like to obviously hear what Mariya has to say about this from the student perspective, but also, I guess, the academic point that I find very interesting in the examples you've given is this universal phenomena of taking the memories out of their political context and reducing the time period to, be it the genes or a certain food or an object that then encapsulates all the complexities of the time for the individual, but obviously has to leave out so much of the political, economic, social context or hardship, that this is where we see memory doing its maybe also somewhat dangerous work by being reduced to, well, the blue jeans, for instance. Mariya, are there 1990s parties at HSE? And have you attended some, if there are any?
Oh, I haven't attended any, but I know that there are actually. And I think that's the observation about the fashion being the main channel of feeling and remembering about the 90s by the younger generation is very spot on. So I think fashion really is the main token sign of how the epoch of the 90s is being thought of by younger people. So it's mostly the blue jeans and the blonde hair and the red lipstick. So all kinds of fashion specialities that you could draw from the decade, and probably lacking the political context. And I am myself guilty of this, because when I look through the photographs of my parents from the 90s, I think, it was such a beautiful time, probably because they look so young and they look so stylish with their padded shoulders and wild hair. I think that's absolutely beautiful. But then I remember that there's always more to this. It's not just a picture. It's multi-dimensional in a sense.
So Oleg, in your upcoming projects, I mean, as a museum, of course, your mission is to build that bridge between the beautiful hair and the padded shoulder, and at the same time convey, guys, this is taking place under very specific political circumstances. So how does the museum, I mean, it's a very fine line. I mean, how in upcoming projects are you engaging with that challenge?
Next year, we are going to run an ambitious project, The Non-Soviet People. That's the name we choose. The aim of it is to find out sources of collective memories of the 90s in the minds of people who were born in the 21st century. The idea is that today's teenagers would interview their relatives who witnessed the epoch, elder sisters, parents, teachers. And these interviews should result in multimedia long reads. And the first step has already been taken. We launched a campaign to collect a photo bank of family photo archives, just like Mariya mentioned the photo of her family. Please, Mariya, join. I'll send you the link, and I'll put the link. And yes, I will appreciate, and I put the link to our discussion in Zoom. So the idea is to collect photo bank of family photos archived from the 90s on a simple platform, and we offer young people to post and describe the photo, attribute them, indicating the place, specific time, event, and short biographical information on those captured in it. And this photo bank will become the material for working on multimedia long grids for this, the Non-Soviet People project I mentioned. And we invite Lutohin as a consultant because he knows how things done. He is a good digital anthropologist, and we really hope that with his help, we will manage.
Okay. One other dimension I would like to bring in, since we've talked a lot about time and the changes over time and between generations, of course, in a country such as Russia, the spatial dimension is super important. And it seems that 1991 and the 1990s is very much tied to Moscow. And I'm really happy that we've got you, Oleg, here for kind of the Yekaterinburg, kind of one non-Moscow perspective. But Olga, could you kind of do a little bit of mapping for us? Are there regional patterns that you can identify looking at kind of this vast territory of the Russian Federation? Is there a regional dynamic, and how does it look of memory of the 1990s?
Yes, it definitely is there, but I'm afraid this aspect hasn't been investigated yet. So I can only express my guesses, as we have no research on this.
I'm sure they will be good.
Yeah. Russia is a very diverse country, and the results of these 30 years of post-Soviet development were very different for different regions of Russia. We have a very famous typology proposed by the geographer Natalia Zubarevich, who speaks, actually it's old, it was proposed 10 years ago, and probably now it's slightly different. However, we have one part of Russia which is associated with capital cities and large cities like Yekaterinburg. And basically what we know about memory about the 1990s in Russia is about this Russia first, meaning that it's Russia of large cities. We also have the second Russia. This is the Russia of industrial towns, which were largely constructed in the Soviet period, and many of which have decreased with economic reforms. And in many places, things are still quite not very good. And we can suggest that memory about the 1990s, such places will be negative, and we can do nothing about it because it's a real experience of people, and they, in a sense, still live in the 1990s, meaning that they have no access to many developments that happened later because of economic reasons. And the third Russia is the Russia of agricultural regions, and again they are very diverse, but quite a lot of these regions are still economically depressed. Not all definitely, but many. And again, I believe that memory about the 1990s will be negative, and it will be very much connected to everyday situation. But let me conclude with the fact that we have no research about it. It's something that still needs to be studied.
Yeah, so here we've just identified another PhD topic, so that's good news for anyone who is interested. And Oleg, how does the center try to engage with that diversity? I mean, you're presenting to a large extent, if I remember correctly, kind of a Moscow-based narrative in Yekaterinburg, which is already a decentering taking place. But does the center have the ambition to speak beyond that? I mean, do you travel to the Ural, smaller towns in the Urals, or beyond that to share some of your historical exhibitions or lectures and discussions? Is that part of your remit at all, or is it centered on Yekaterinburg and that is it?
Thanks, Félix. Thanks for this question. It is important, and you know, we are lucky in this sense because we are located almost 2,000 kilometers from Moscow. Can you imagine? And have access in that sense to witnesses of the era from the regions, from Ural regions and far beyond. And we have an access to such three Russias that Olga quote from Natalia Zubarevich, because they are all close here in the Urals. They're all close to Yekaterinburg, not mentioned the Yekaterinburg, but also small cities near.
It is close geographically to Moscow too, Moscow region.
Right. Yeah, right. So we have an access to such a people, and we invite them to the museum to share their memories. There is a trolley bus in our museum exhibition. I will show you one more photo, in which we hold these meetings on a variety of topics, like how did schools and universities exist in the 90s? How did the privatization go? How were the first non-Soviet money earned? And from this year, we began to work on the oral history archive. So now we are recording these stories on video in interview format. This is how we try to answer on this that Olga mentioned, this lack of other voices in our exhibition. Of course, the 90s is very complicated objects. That's why it is important to us, way more important, to invite people to share their own experience, which is traumatic in a sense for many of our citizens and for many of our visitors. And that's one more function of our center, or mission, like a sub-mission for our center, to be the place of psychological relief and therapy, if you let me say so, because it is important to let these people speak and to let their voices hear from Yekaterinburg. And thanks to thanks to the people who make a decision to build the center, not in Moscow or St. Petersburg, and decided to build it here in Yekaterinburg, right on the border between Europe and Asia, right in the middle of our huge, enormously huge country. I hope I answer your question. Yeah.
But as I know, Yeltsin Center is now in Moscow as well. I didn't follow. Has it opened?
Well, it is. It will be the teaser for our Moscow and international audience, because it will be a small teaser of our exhibition. It's not kind of a filial of the center itself. It's more like a Moscow headquarter for our foundation.
It hasn't opened yet, because it was planned for December.
It's under construction. It's not. We hope in 2022.
Okay, we've got a question from the audience. Judy Dempsey has a question to, I think, really all three of you. And that is again about the generations, and the question about what parents want to transmit to their children when they speak about the 1990s. And she remembers when she was reporting in Eastern and Central Europe during the 1980s, parents actually did not want to talk about the past to their offspring. And she mentioned something which kind of in several autocratic contexts one can observe, is that memory actually jumps one generation, that it's grandparents who transmit to the children because the parents, for whatever reason, kind of want to take their distance. And Mariya, maybe that's a nice occasion to bring you back. I mean, who talked with you about the past of the 1990s? I mean, what's the role of your grandparents? You mentioned your parents already, and you don't have to kind of say it for you, but for your generation. What's the role of grandparents relating Soviet and kind of early post-Soviet history to those who have no direct experience?
I think actually Judy is right in saying that grandparents usually are the ones that are the most eager to share their experiences regarding the past, and it's been the same experience with me too. So my grandmother is significantly more eager to talk about the past than, for example, my mother. And concerning the parents, well, I actually only have one set of parents, so I can only talk for myself and not the whole generation probably, but mine don't really like to talk about the 90s as much, and when they do, it's usually done with irony, because as Oleg has mentioned, I think there's a residual trauma connected with the poverty and the fear of crime, and it's still a sensitive topic for the people of 90s to talk about it and to try to convey the impression of that period. And I think grandparents usually they had more time to process that, and they were more mature when this period has has passed. So usually, yeah, the grandparents talk about it more. I think that that would be the general impression of my generation.
Mm-hmm. Olga, can you relate to that? I mean, you're not a grandmother, but
I am.
you're a grandmother.
am.
So, we invert the perspectives then.
My granddaughter is 7. I
So-
was a young mother. You know, in the 1990s, it was quite normal to have your first child at 20. So for this reason, I have 2 adult children, the son and the daughter. And while listening to you, I asked myself whether I talk with them about the 1990s. Well, probably I do not do it specifically. It's a part of some family memory, and I think they are interested in learning how was their early childhood. And in this context, some stories come into discussion, and we remember about some difficulties we had in the 1990s. And as they are now my son is and his wife are parents, and they struggle with similar problems. They become surprised when I tell them how it was when with me and them as children. Yeah, I think it's lovely part of family story, meaning that it's a point when you discuss your experience with your children.
And based on that, would you say that as a grandparent, I mean, you see yourself having a special role in the transmission of the past, then maybe even more important than that of your son and your daughter for the transmission
I'm
of the history
afraid
to their child?
I had no experience of speaking about this with my granddaughter. She just wasn't interested about it yet. So
But in the future, what do you think?
In the future, well, I try to make my role as a grandmother special because I do not take everyday care about her as grandmothers of my children did. So I try to bring something special to your life. Maybe someday it will be stories about the 1990s.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now we've got a few more questions in the chat, but Oleg, just for you, slightly changed version of that. Do you see in the center that grandparents come with the second generation and visit and maybe have more agency in bringing to the second generation that history? You're nodding. Could you give some context to that?
Yes, and I want to thank Judy for such a brilliant and amazing question, because it allows me to speak about maybe the most valuable thing in our museum, in our exhibition, because it offers the ground for the discussion, this intergenerational discussion, because the most valuable thing that I can see from my director perspective from the fourth floor of the museum, it's when daughter and father came to the exhibition, and then going outside the exhibition, they discussed something. I cannot hear what they discussed specifically, but I see the discussion, and I see how our museum provoke this discussion, because it is hard to imagine how you, and I agree with Olga, it is hard to imagine yourself sitting under the dining table during the dinner or lunch and discussing the 90s or history of your country with your daughter. My daughter is 3 years old, and well, I'm not sure that in 10 years we will discuss it under the dining table in the kitchen, but we will discuss it here in our museum. And Olga, I invite you with your granddaughter to Yekaterinburg, because I believe that if you come here, you and your granddaughter will find an interest and will find some common ground to this very important discussion, because I truly believe that we have to discuss our past with our next generations.
Okay, thank you to both of you. There's a, to all three of you. There's a question from Roberto Rabia from King's College London, and it addresses, it speaks to Olga and Oleg. Olga, the question for you is, Roberto has the impression that the negative myth of the 1990s is primarily based on emotions and very general conditions rather than precise historical or political events. So his question is whether you agree with this interpretation of his, and what role historical events can possibly play in how the decade is remembered rather than only the very generalized feelings. That's the question for you, and connected to this, so I'll just convey that question to you as well, Oleg. In the center or in the museum, how are more controversial events of the decade represented? And Roberto is thinking about the kind of the first Chechen War, for instance, or 1993. How is that contextualized and embedded in the general framing of the 1990s?
Should I start?
Please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very good question. Well, I would say that yes and no. Yes, of course, the memory about the 1990s is very much emotionally imbued. And it is emotions that conduct greatly the attitude towards it. However, it's also true that it's all very badly remembered. So when you start asking people about some specific aspects, you can see that there are not very many things that they actually remember. So you're right, memory is very much generalized. However, it very much depends on personal experience. And if you talk with people who had experience of political activism in the 1990s, and actually very many people were involved in political activity, their memories will be colored by this experience. However, if we talk with people who were in opposition to economic reforms, and actually there was strong opposition to economic reforms and strong political struggles, and many people who were involved in politics were involved on the other side, their memory will be again very emotional but very different. However, it's also true that the majority of people were not involved in political activity. There were many people who were involved, but not the majority. And for them, memory about the 1990s is very much based on some secondary impressions, including political discourse. And I believe that what was done with political uses of memory is very important. With the films, with music and other things. And I'm trying to catch up the question that is now in the chat concerning perception of foreign policy. Thank you for this question, because perception of the foreign policy is also a very important aspect that shapes attitudes towards the 1990s. Many people believe that in the 1990s, Russia failed with its foreign policy. They believe that it was bad foreign politics. They believe that Russia has lost its position in the world and it was a bad thing. And they are proud with what happens with Putin's coming. So these emotions are also very, very strong. And we should remember that at the moment, the official propaganda is very much fostering these negative emotions. And when you listen every day about bad things that happened against Russia, when you are told about Russophobia, of course, it supports this negative feeling about foreign policy about the 1990s. However, by the way, visiting Yeltsin Museum in Yekaterinburg, I think one can think differently because you have a very nice exposition about Yeltsin's second presidential term, and you have these pictures and these material objects telling about how Russia was accepted, by the way, as a strong country, how Russia became the member of the eight, the number of eight, club of eight most strong, most important countries. All this is demonstrated in the museum, and probably it comes to a kind of surprise with the propaganda that people listen quite often nowadays.
Okay, Oleg, over to you for the difficult moments in history. How does the center present them?
Yes, this is one more brilliant question for our audience. Such a great audience we have. That's amazing. Of course, in our museum, we have the whole galleries dedicated to this event, both 1993 and the First Chechen War, and the default as well. Olga mentioned this gallery on international politics, but in the same gallery, there is a huge, how do you call it? Infographics dedicated to the default of the 1998. Without this complicated and controversial events, it is hard to get the full image of 90s, and it is hard to get the full image of modern Russia as well. It is presented, but it is not enough, I would say. That's why in our programs, we continue all the time, we continue the discussion of this event, because there is no, the general discourse, the common discourse on it, on First Chechen War, what it was. Was it a war? Was it a tragedy? We call it tragedy in our museum, the Chechen tragedy. So we continue to discuss this event, and if we go back to the Chechen War, we had a small theater. This is a contemporary drama, if you like me to say so, and we had the spectacle named "Война, которой не было," the war we never had. That's the fluent translation, and it is made. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to remember all the names. Made by the diaries, the Chechen diaries of Polina Жеребцова, little girl who go through this war. It was published by Corpus publishing house here in Russia under the name Muravей в железной банке and in the glass jar. So speaking about such a controversial event, events of the 90s, we are trying to focus not only the historical perspective, but as well on the art perspective of the perspective of performing arts. And that's for us the chance to continue to discuss it, because as I mentioned, we are the first presidential center. No one knows how presidential centers should look at our country and what they should do actually, and I truly believe that our goal and our mission also is to make a public discourse on such a traumatic and difficult controversial events you mentioned in your question. Thank you for that.
Okay, we're nearing the end. There are a few questions. I'll have to select a little bit now, but one I wanted to pass on to Olga, since it's kind of touching on the most important issues once again. Coming from Facebook, from Ashot Alexanyan, the question of how the Russian statehood, in your opinion, is connected with the Yeltsin Center Museum. I mean, does it affect the image of Russian political leadership, in your opinion?
Well, we discussed it in the very beginning of our meeting, and I think Oleg described it very correctly. Well, the thing is that Yeltsin Center is conducted by NGO, non-government organization, which of course gets a lot of money from the state, but formally it is independent from the state. Of course, only formally because of money. But it allows the Russian state to support Yeltsin Center without being that deeply involved in this activity, meaning that I think they really support Yeltsin Center for the reasons we also discussed, because it's the institute, quite new institute devoted to the first president. And we definitely believe that the next presidents also will get their own president center. And it's about the institute of presidentship, not necessarily about supporting people who are associated, politically associated with the narrative of the Yeltsin Center. So supporting Yeltsin Center for the government doesn't mean to support the liberals. However, in public discourse, it's quite often perceived in this way, which to my mind is not quite correct. And the arrangement that allows to distance from Yeltsin Center is this hybrid format of the organization that runs the Yeltsin Center. The Yeltsin Center is not a part of Ministry of Culture, not at all.
Mm.
And thank you, Ashot, for your question. I'm also pleased to learn that you listen to our discussion.
Okay, I think this brings us to the end of our discussion. Members of the audience mentioned that they are getting hungry, and depending on what time zone you're in, you might feel the same. There are questions, obviously, that we couldn't touch on, and Judy Damsey asked the big $1 million question that we need to write a book on, or read many other books on. I mean, how does memory really influence contemporary politics? And of course, that's the question that we as researchers grapple with a lot and try to understand. But I would leave that for everyone to digest and take home. I wanted to thank all three of you, first of all, Mariya, Olga, and Oleg, for your inputs, for your thoughts and contribution to our discussion. It was fascinating learning from you and hearing your different perspectives on that period. So thank you very much for your time and sharing your insights with us, not only in Berlin, but I guess now we are kind of transnational by default. So thank you for that. Thanks also to everyone in the audience for listening and asking such well-informed questions. It was a pleasure getting to read those, getting to know you a little bit through the questions, and take the time to kind of click through the YouTube channel, Facebook, where there are recordings of other events that took place in relation to 30 post-Soviet years. There's a whole library now that has developed on the ZOiS webpage, but obviously also look at what the Yeltsin Center does. There are digital resources available as well. And Olga has published extensively on the period, so I can only recommend reading her work as well. And of course, to also follow Mariya as she progresses through her career from student to the next step. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a very nice end of the year. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting.
Большое спасибо. До свидания. Bye.
До свидания.